They didn't come to kneel, but that's how history remembers them. The sky above the ruined plane glowed a dull amber, light filtering through layers of drifting ash that turned every breath into something dry and metallic on Ethan Cole's tongue. His boots crunching over sand fused into glass by heat he didn't want to think about. The remains of machines half buried like bones beneath a desert that hadn't existed a week ago, and somewhere in the distance, a fractured signal kept pinging weakly against his suit. A reminder that he was alone now, or close enough to it. His oxygen readout flickered at 61%, not critical yet, but low enough that every inhale felt counted, measured, borrowed. And still he kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the voices that weren't there anymore. A soft sound cut through the wind, not mechanical, not debris shifting, something smaller, almost human, and Ethan turned, rifle lifting by instinct before his mind caught up, scanning the jagged silhouette of a collapsed transport half swallowed by sand. And there, just beyond it, he saw her, blue against gold, a shape too deliberate to be debris, half buried, motionless except for the faint rise and fall that told him she was still breathing. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, the servos in his suit whining softly as they compensated for fatigue. And when he got close enough, her eyes opened, sharp and bright like cold stars, locking onto him with a clarity that made something in his chest tighten. She tried to move, failed, and still managed to lift her hand slightly, as if pointing something unseen at him, her voice thin but edged with something unbroken as the translator struggled and then caught up, rendering her words in clipped, accented English. Human, you should have left. Ethan exhaled, a slow, steady breath, lowering his weapon without fully thinking about it, because there was something in her gaze that didn't match the stories he'd been told. Not fear, not hatred exactly, something more complicated, something tired. He crouched beside her, the heat radiating off the ground seeping through even the insulation of his gear, and took in the details: skin like faintly glowing glass, hair threaded with silver, armor cracked but still clinging to her like it had been grown rather than worn. "They're not going anywhere like this," he muttered, more to himself than to her, pulling a compact med strip from his kit and pressing it gently along the worst of the damage he could see, careful, precise, the way training had drilled into him long before this war had a name. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath, her eyes narrowing as if trying to understand why he hadn't finished what he started, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the wind filling the silence with a low, endless whisper. Then she said, quieter now, "Your kind only takes." Ethan shook his head once, not in denial, but in something closer to refusal, as he slid one arm carefully beneath her shoulders, the other under her legs, feeling the unexpected lightness of her weight and the unfamiliar warmth of her skin even through the suit, and lifted her up against his chest, her breath catching as the world shifted around her. "Not today," he said, adjusting his stance as the added weight recalibrated his balance, the suit compensating with a soft hum. And then he turned, away from the wreckage, away from the signal pings fading into static, and started walking, one step at a time into a horizon that didn't promise anything except distance, carrying something he didn't understand, and for reasons he couldn't explain, refusing to let go. The weight settled in slowly, not heavy enough to break him, but constant enough to remind Ethan with every step that he was no longer moving for himself alone. The servos in his suit adjusting in quiet increments as they crossed uneven ground where the sand shifted like loose powder over hardened glass, each footstep slipping just enough to demand focus, and her breath, faint but steady, warmed the front of his armor through layers of composite plating as if defying the cold wind that cut across the open plain. His visor flickered with intermittent warnings, power conservation protocols suggesting he reduce load, reduce movement, reduce everything, but none of those options accounted for the living presence in his arms, and so he ignored them, pushing forward toward a jagged line of broken structures on the horizon that might offer shelter or at least a break from the endless exposure. For a long stretch, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the distant hum of the atmosphere and the soft mechanical rhythm of his suit compensating for strain, until her voice came again, quieter now, less sharp, as if the edge had dulled under exhaustion. You carry your enemy as if she matters. The translator rendering each word with a slight delay that made it feel more deliberate. Ethan adjusted his grip slightly, careful not to jar her, eyes fixed ahead. You are not my enemy right now, he said, the sentence simple, almost plain, but it lingered between them like something heavier than either expected. She shifted faintly, enough for him to feel the subtle tension in her body, the instinct to pull away that she did not fully act on. And after a moment she said, Your kind arrives, takes resources, leaves ruin. The words less accusation now and more statement, like a fact she had always known. Ethan let out a slow breath, watching the numbers tick down in the corner of his display. 56% oxygen, battery reserves dipping lower with each mile. Maybe, he replied. But that does not mean we cannot choose something else. And even as he said it, he wondered if he believed it, or if he simply needed to. A gust of wind swept across the plain, carrying fine particles that rattled softly against his armor, and she turned her head slightly, eyes tracking the horizon with a focus that had not been there before, as if she was measuring distance, direction, something unseen. And then she went still again, her voice dropping to something almost uncertain. Why? Just that. A single word, stripped of pride, stripped of certainty. Ethan did not answer immediately, because there was no clean explanation, no mission parameter that justified this. No order he could point to. And finally he said, because I can. The same quiet truth he had carried longer than any weapon. The terrain shifted as they approached the fractured remains of what might have been a research outpost. Angular walls half collapsed but still standing enough to break the wind, and Ethan angled toward it, boots crunching over debris as he crossed the threshold into shadow, where the air felt marginally stiller, cooler in a way that was almost a relief, and he lowered her carefully onto a relatively stable section of floor, his movements deliberate, respectful, as if setting down something fragile rather than someone who had moments ago called him an invader. For a second he just stood there, catching his breath, the sound loud in his own ears, and when he looked down at her, she was already watching him, that same bright gaze now carrying something new, not trust, not yet, but something close to recognition, as if she was beginning to understand that whatever this moment was, it did not fit the story she had been told about his kind. And outside, beyond the broken walls, the wind continued to move across the battlefield, carrying with it signals neither of them could yet fully hear. The structure groaned softly as the wind pressed against its fractured walls, a low metallic hum that settled into the background like a heartbeat too slow to notice unless you listened for it. And Ethan found himself listening without meaning to, crouched near the entrance with his helmet partially retracted to conserve power, the air still dry, but easier to breathe than the open plain, his lungs expanding with a steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar after miles of measured breaths. Across from him, Lyra remained where he had placed her, propped slightly against a slanted panel, her posture more stable now though her movements were still minimal, her luminous skin dimmer in the shadow, as if the absence of direct light made her seem more fragile, or perhaps more real. He checked his wrist display, numbers blinking in muted amber, oxygen at 51%, battery reserves lower than he liked, internal temperature regulation compensating for the drop in ambient heat, and beneath it all, a faint anomaly reading he could not quite interpret, something tied to her proximity that caused subtle fluctuations across his system. You are deteriorating, she said after a moment, her voice steadier now, less strained, the translator catching more fluidly. Your systems react to me. And there was no accusation in it this time, only observation. Ethan glanced up, meeting her eyes, then back to the readout. Yeah, noticed that, he replied, his tone almost dry despite the situation, and he moved closer, kneeling within arm's reach, pulling a compact thermal layer from his pack and draping it lightly over her shoulders, adjusting it with care that felt instinctive, rather than calculated. She watched his hands as he worked, the small, precise movements, the way he avoided unnecessary pressure, and something in her expression shifted again, not softer exactly, but less guarded, as if she was trying to reconcile what she saw with what she believed. Your biology is incompatible, she said quietly. Prolonged contact will weaken you. And for the first time, there was something almost like hesitation in her voice, as if the information mattered now in a way it had not before. Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his weight against a cracked support beam, exhaling slowly. "Then I guess we do not make this prolonged," he said, though neither of them moved to increase the distance between them, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the faint crackle of failing circuitry somewhere deeper in the structure, the whisper of wind threading through narrow gaps, and the quiet, shared awareness of time passing. Outside, the horizon shifted as the light dimmed, the amber glow fading toward a colder gray, and Lyra turned her head slightly, her gaze unfocused for a second, as if she was listening to something far beyond the range of human senses, her fingers curling faintly against the thermal layer. "There is a signal," she murmured, almost to herself. "It spreads through the atmosphere." And Ethan felt a subtle vibration through the floor beneath him, so faint it might have been imagined, except his suit registered it a moment later as a low-frequency disturbance. He pushed himself upright, stepping toward the entrance, scanning the sky where the ash clouds thinned just enough to reveal a distant shimmer, not movement exactly, but a distortion that did not belong to wind or weather. Behind him, Lyra's voice came again, more focused now, carrying a weight that had not been there before. "It is mine," she said, and the words hung in the air between them, heavier than any weapon he had carried. "My kind will follow it." Ethan stood still for a second, his hand resting against the edge of the doorway, the cold metal grounding him, and then he looked back at her, really looked this time, seeing not just the injured figure, but the implications she carried with her, the scale of something far larger than either of them in this broken place. "And what happens when they get here?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he needed answered, and Lyra held his gaze, her eyes reflecting the dim light like distant stars, the answer forming slowly. "That depends," she said, "on what they believe they will find." The question lingered between them longer than the wind outside, settling into the hollow space of the broken structure like something that refused to dissipate, and Ethan felt it press against his thoughts in a way no tactical decision ever had, because this was not about survival anymore, not in the simple sense. It was about consequence, about what his next choice would ripple into beyond the reach of his own life. He shifted his stance slightly, the joints in his suit responding with a muted whine as he stepped back inside, away from the doorway where the sky still shimmered with that distant, unnatural distortion, and his eyes returned to Lyra, searching for something in her expression that might anchor the situation into something measurable. "You said it depends," he repeated, slower this time, as if pacing the words might change their weight. "So what do they expect to find?" And he realized as he asked it that he already suspected the answer would not favor him. Lyra's gaze did not waver, but there was a subtle change in the way her shoulders settled beneath the thermal layer, a small release of tension that suggested she had crossed some internal threshold. "They expect resistance," she said, her voice even, almost calm in a way that contrasted with the implication. "They expect hostility, confirmation of what they already believe about your kind." And for a moment the translator lagged just enough to make the final words feel heavier as they arrived. Ethan let out a quiet breath, running a hand briefly along the side of his helmet before letting it fall again, the gesture more habit than necessity. "So they come ready to finish something," he said, not asking now, just aligning the pieces as they fell into place, and Lyra inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, the movement precise despite her condition. The faint vibration in the structure grew more noticeable, still subtle, but no longer ignorable, a low resonance that hummed through the floor and into Ethan's boots, registering on his display as a rising environmental anomaly. And with it came a shift in the air pressure that made the space feel smaller, more contained, as if the world outside was tightening around them. Ethan glanced at his readouts again, oxygen dipping below 50% now, battery reserves continuing their steady decline, the numbers forming a quiet countdown he could not stop, and beneath them the same anomaly pulsed in irregular intervals, tied to her presence, to that signal she had mentioned. "And you," he said, turning his attention fully back to her. "What do you believe they should find?" And this time there was no hesitation in his voice, only a directness that came from having no time left for anything else. Lyra was silent for a few seconds, her eyes shifting slightly as if focusing on something far beyond the walls, something only she could perceive, and when she spoke, it was softer than before, not weaker, but more deliberate. "I believe they should find what they expect," she said, and there was something almost distant in the phrasing, like she was speaking about a version of herself that was already fading. But now, she paused, the word hanging unfinished, and Ethan saw it then, the smallest flicker of uncertainty, not in her strength, but in her certainty, and it changed the entire space between them. He took a step closer without thinking, the motion slow, unthreatening, and lowered himself back into a crouch within her line of sight. "Now what?" he prompted quietly, and outside, the sky's distortion sharpened, faint lines of light beginning to form within the haze like distant reflections off something vast and approaching. Lyra's gaze returned to him, steady but no longer closed. And in that moment there was no rank, no division, just two beings in a place that had been stripped down to choices. "Now I do not know," she said, and the honesty in it was more disarming than any weapon. "And that uncertainty will reach them as well." Ethan felt the weight of that settle into him, heavier than her physical presence had ever been, because uncertainty was not something you could plan for, not something you could counter with force, and yet it was the only thing that might change what was coming. The vibration intensified slightly, the air carrying a faint, almost inaudible tone that resonated just at the edge of perception, and Ethan looked once more toward the doorway, where the sky no longer looked like sky at all, but like something opening, something arriving, and behind him, Lyra drew a slow breath, as if preparing for a moment neither of them could fully see yet, only feel approaching with every passing second. The sound came first, not loud, not sudden, but deep and steady like something immense breathing just beyond the limits of sight, a resonance that pressed against Ethan's chest from the inside, as much as it vibrated through the fractured floor beneath his boots, and he knew without needing confirmation that whatever was coming had already arrived in a way that could not be stopped, only met. He moved to the doorway again, slower this time, not out of fear but out of awareness, and the sky above. The battlefield no longer resembled anything natural. The ash clouds parted into layered ribbons of light that curved and folded as if space itself was being gently pulled aside, revealing shapes far too large to fully comprehend, silhouettes forming within the distortion, silent and patient. His suit responded with a cascade of alerts he ignored, his attention fixed on the horizon that was no longer distant but descending, closing the space between orbit and ground in a way that made distance feel meaningless. Behind him, Lyra shifted, a subtle motion but enough to draw his attention back, and when he turned, she was watching the same opening in the sky, her expression no longer guarded but focused, as if every instinct she had was aligning toward this moment. "They are here," she said, and there was no fear in it, only certainty. Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to her, and stepped back inside the dim shelter, now feeling less like protection and more like a boundary between what had been and what was about to be, and he crossed the distance between them again, kneeling without hesitation as if the motion had become natural, inevitable. "Then we decide what they see," he said quietly, the words simple but carrying everything he had left, and Lyra studied him for a long second, her eyes searching his face as if trying to measure something that could not be quantified by strength or technology. The vibration intensified, the air humming with a frequency that made the edges of his vision shimmer, and the anomaly on his display surged in response to her presence, to the signal she carried, a bridge between two worlds now fully connected. "You do not understand what you are choosing," she said, her voice steady but softer than before, and Ethan allowed himself a small, almost tired smile, the kind that came from knowing the outcome did not matter as much as the decision. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I understand enough." And with that, he reached forward, adjusting the thermal layer around her shoulders again, a small, human gesture that felt almost out of place against the scale of what surrounded them. Outside, the first of the massive forms broke through the last veil of cloud, not descending aggressively but arriving with a deliberate stillness, as if observing before acting, and the light that followed was not harsh but diffused, casting long shadows across the broken terrain that stretched toward the structure like silent questions. Lyra drew a slow breath, her hand lifting slightly, not toward him this time, but toward the open sky beyond the doorway, her fingers trembling just enough to betray the weight of what she was about to do. And Ethan watched her, not interrupting, not guiding, simply present in the moment she now controlled. They will read my signal, she said, more to herself than to him. They will feel what I feel. And the words settled into the space like a key turning in a lock. Ethan leaned back slightly, giving her space without stepping away, his eyes shifting once more to the sky where the enormous shapes held their position, waiting. And for the first time since the battlefield fell silent, he felt something unfamiliar settle into him. Not fear, not hope exactly, but a quiet acceptance of whatever came next. Lyra's hand steadied, the faint glow of her skin brightening just enough to cast a soft light across the interior walls. And when she spoke again, it was not directed at him, but outward, into the vast presence above, her voice carrying a resonance that extended beyond sound, beyond language. And in that moment, everything paused, as if the entire world was listening for her answer. The moment stretched beyond sound, beyond breath, as if time itself had paused to listen, and Ethan felt it in the stillness of the air, in the way the low vibration that had filled the structure suddenly stabilized into something almost steady, almost calm, like a held note waiting to resolve. Lyra's hand remained lifted, her fingers no longer trembling but aligned with a quiet certainty that had not been there before, and the faint glow beneath her skin intensified just enough to cast soft reflections across the fractured walls, turning sharp edges into something almost fluid. Outside, the massive forms in the sky held their position, no longer advancing, no longer descending, simply present, their scale impossible to measure, but undeniable in the way they bent the light around them. And for the first time since Ethan had seen them, they did not feel like an approaching force, but like an audience. His suit registered a sudden shift in the anomaly, the erratic pulses smoothing into a consistent pattern that synced with the faint resonance in the air, and he realized with a quiet clarity that whatever Lyra was transmitting was no longer just a signal. It was a state, a reflection of something internal now reaching far beyond her physical form. He watched her closely, not interrupting, not moving, aware that even the smallest action might break something fragile that had formed between intention and outcome. Her voice came again, but not in words he could fully hear, not through the translator, but as a tone layered beneath sound, something that resonated more than it spoke. And though he could not understand it, he could feel its shape, its direction, its lack of hostility. And that absence was more powerful than any declaration. The pressure in the air eased slightly, not disappearing but shifting, as if the weight that had pressed down on the battlefield was being reconsidered, and Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, his chest rising against the constraints of his suit as his oxygen dipped further, now below 45%. The numbers steady in their descent even as the world around him balanced on something immeasurable. Lyra lowered her hand gradually, the motion controlled, deliberate, and when her gaze returned to him, there was something new in it, not uncertainty this time, but recognition, not of him as an individual, but of what he represented in that moment, a variable her people had not accounted for. They feel it, she said softly, the translator catching up again, her voice carrying a quiet awe that had replaced the earlier distance. They feel restraint. And the word lingered, unfamiliar but fitting, as if it had not existed in her vocabulary before now. Ethan nodded once, not because he fully understood, but because he understood enough, and he shifted his weight slightly, the strain in his legs more noticeable now, the fatigue settling deeper into his muscles as the suit compensated less efficiently with each passing minute. Outside, the light shifted again, the immense shapes in the sky adjusting their orientation by degrees so small they were almost imperceptible, yet the effect was unmistakable, a change in posture, in presence, like a decision being made without motion. The low hum that had filled the air began to recede, not abruptly but gradually, as if something vast was pulling back from the edge of action, and with it came a subtle release in the atmosphere, a space opening where tension had been, Ethan stepped toward the doorway once more, drawn by the shift, and what he saw held him there, still and silent, as the shapes above did not descend further, did not advance, but instead held their distance, maintaining a line that felt less like a boundary and more like a choice. Behind him, Lyra exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing beneath the thermal layer, and though neither of them spoke for several seconds, the silence was no longer heavy. It was filled with something quieter, something that did not demand immediate resolution. Ethan glanced down at his readout again, the numbers continuing their steady decline, a reminder that while something vast had paused, his own limits had not, and he looked back at her, meeting her eyes with a question he did not need to voice. She understood it anyway, her expression steady, grounded now in a way it had not been before. "This is not the end," she said, her voice calm, certain. "It is only the moment they decide what comes next." And outside, the sky remained open, the massive forms still watching, waiting, as if the next movement belonged not to them, but to something much smaller standing beneath their gaze. The stillness did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, almost respectfully, like something immense reconsidering its own weight, and Ethan felt that change first in the silence where the low hum had been, the absence louder than the sound itself, a vacuum where expectation had lived moments before. He stood at the edge of the doorway, shoulders squared out of habit more than strength now, his breathing measured but thinner, each inhale shallower than the last as his oxygen dipped toward 40%, the number blinking steadily in the corner of his vision like a quiet reminder that whatever choice the sky made, his own clock was already running out. Behind him, Lyra moved slightly, not with urgency, but with intention, shifting her weight as if testing the limits of her recovery, her fingers brushing against the cold floor before she steadied herself against the broken panel. And when she looked toward the opening again, her expression carried something new, not awe, not fear, but a kind of awareness that extended beyond her own survival. "They are not leaving," she said, her voice calm, almost analytical now, as if she was reading something written across the sky that he could not see, and Ethan followed her gaze, watching as the massive forms above held their distance with an exactness that felt deliberate, neither advancing nor retreating, maintaining a presence that was no longer threatening but not yet peaceful. "They are waiting," he replied, the words coming without thought, because it was the only interpretation that made sense, and the idea settled between them like a challenge rather than a relief. Lyra's eyes shifted back to him, studying his face in a way that felt less like judgment and more like assessment, as if she was trying to understand the variable he had introduced into a system that had never accounted for it. "Your kind acts without consensus," she said quietly. "One chooses, and it alters the perception of many." And there was no accusation in it, only recognition. Ethan let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh if he had more air to spare. "Yeah," he said. "We are not great at waiting for permission." And the simplicity of it seemed to resonate in the space more than anything more complex could have. The light outside shifted again, softer now, the harsh edges of shadow easing into something more diffused, and the massive silhouettes adjusted once more, their positions aligning in a formation that felt less like containment and more like observation, as if they were no longer preparing to act, but to understand. The anomaly readings on his display stabilized further, syncing almost completely with Lyra's biological output, and for the first time since he had picked her up, the fluctuations that had drained his system began to level, not reversing the damage but slowing the loss, giving him something he had not expected, a little more time. He noticed it immediately, the subtle change in resistance in his breathing, the way his muscles responded with slightly less delay, and he glanced down at the display before looking back at her. "Something changed," he said, not questioning, just acknowledging, and Lyra nodded once, a small, precise motion. "They are adjusting to me," she explained, "to what I am showing them." And her gaze lifted again toward the sky, her expression steady, grounded in a way that suggested she understood the scale of what was happening even if she could not control it entirely. Ethan leaned lightly against the doorway, conserving energy without stepping back, his eyes tracing the shapes above, and for the first time he did not feel small beneath them, not insignificant, but present, part of a moment that extended beyond his own life. "So what now?" he asked, not because he expected a clear answer, but because the question itself felt necessary, and Lyra's response came after a brief pause, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that had replaced the earlier doubt. "Now they decide if one act is enough to redefine an entire species," and the word settled into him with a weight that was both heavy and strangely light, because it was no longer about what he could do, but about what had already been done. Outside, the sky remained open, the vast forms holding their position as if suspended between two outcomes, and inside the broken structure, two figures waited beneath that silent judgment, one measuring the limits of his breath, the other measuring the reach of a choice that had already begun to echo across the stars. Time stretched thinner with every breath Ethan took, each inhale scraping slightly more than the last as his oxygen dropped toward the high 30s, the number blinking in a steady rhythm that matched the slow, deliberate beat of his pulse. And yet he remained where he was at the doorway, not out of stubbornness, but because something in him understood that leaving this position would mean stepping away from the moment itself. The sky above had settled into a strange kind of stillness, not empty, not quiet, but observant. The massive forms maintaining their precise distance as if anchored to a decision not yet fully formed, their presence bending the light into soft arcs that drifted across the battlefield like reflections. On water, inside the fractured structure, Lyra shifted again, this time pushing herself slightly more upright, her movements controlled but no longer as limited as before, the glow beneath her skin stabilizing into a steady luminescence that seemed less like injury and more like purpose. And when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that had been building slowly since the moment she raised her hand to the sky. "They are listening beyond me now," she said, her eyes fixed not on the ships themselves, but on something deeper, something transmitted through them. "They are interpreting not just the signal, but the context." And the word felt heavy, complex, something that extended far beyond simple communication. Ethan turned his head slightly, watching her instead of the sky, studying the way her expression had changed, how the earlier distance had been replaced by a kind of grounded awareness that made her seem less like a wounded soldier and more like a bridge between two worlds that had never truly seen each other. "Context," he repeated quietly, tasting the word as if it might explain something his training never had, and Lyra nodded once, her gaze steady. "Your action did not match expectation," she said. "It created a contradiction, and contradiction forces reevaluation." And there was something almost analytical in her tone now, but beneath it, something else, something closer to respect. Outside, the light shifted again, not brighter or darker, but more defined, as if the edges of the enormous shapes were becoming clearer, less abstract, and Ethan realized that they were no longer obscured by the atmosphere. They were choosing to be seen, revealing just enough of their form to communicate presence without threat, a deliberate act that mirrored the restraint Lyra had transmitted. His suit registered another subtle adjustment, the anomaly stabilizing further, reducing the drain on his systems to a slow, manageable decline, and for the first time since he had picked her up, he felt the faint possibility that he might not collapse before this moment reached its conclusion. He exhaled slowly, leaning his shoulder against the edge of the doorway, the cool metal, grounding him as he watched the sky with a focus that had shifted from survival to observation. "So they are thinking," he said, more to himself than to her, and Lyra's response came without delay. "They are adapting," she corrected gently, and the distinction mattered in a way he could not fully articulate. A low, almost imperceptible ripple moved through the air, not a sound but a change in pressure, and Ethan felt it against his skin even through the suit, a subtle expansion that made the space feel larger, more open, as if the battlefield itself was being given room to exist again. Lyra drew a deeper breath than before, her shoulders rising beneath the thermal layer, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that seemed to anchor the entire moment. "They are searching for confirmation," she said. "One act is not enough, but it is a beginning." And Ethan felt that settle into him with a strange kind of clarity, because it meant that what he had done was not a solution, it was an opening. He glanced down at his display again. Oxygen now hovering near 37%, the numbers continuing their steady descent, and he understood then that whatever came next, he would not have the luxury of waiting indefinitely. He pushed himself off the doorway and took a slow step back inside, closer to her, not because he needed to, but because something in the moment demanded proximity, demanded presence. Then maybe they need to see more, he said quietly. The words simple, but the implication heavier than anything he had carried across that battlefield, and Lyra's eyes met his, not with surprise, but with a recognition that felt almost inevitable, as if she had been waiting for him to reach that conclusion on his own. And outside, the sky remained open, vast and patient, as if it was ready to witness whatever came next. The words lingered between them, simple and heavy at the same time, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if the idea itself needed space to settle before it could become real, and Ethan felt the weight of it press into his chest more than the thinning air ever could, because this was no longer about reacting, it was about choosing again, deliberately, in full view of something vast enough to judge not just actions but intentions. His oxygen dipped closer to the mid-30s, the warning tone softer now, less urgent only because his body had begun to adapt to the strain, each breath slower, more controlled, his focus narrowing not from panic but from clarity. He stepped closer to Lyra, lowering himself into a crouch in front of her, close enough that he could see the fine patterns in her skin where the glow pulsed gently beneath the surface, steady now, no longer erratic, and he reached out without hesitation, adjusting the edge of the thermal layer again, a small, unnecessary motion that carried more meaning than any calculated gesture. Lyra watched him carefully, her eyes tracking every movement, not with suspicion anymore, but with a kind of quiet attention, as if she was studying a phenomenon she had never been taught to expect. "You are weakening," she said softly, not as a warning but as a statement of fact, and Ethan gave a faint nod, not denying it. "Yeah," he replied, his voice calm despite the strain, "but I am still here," and that, more than anything, seemed to shift something in her gaze. Outside, the sky remained unchanged in its position but not in its presence, the massive forms now more defined, their surfaces reflecting faint currents of light that moved like slow tides across their structure. And Ethan could not shake the feeling that they were watching not just what he did, but why he did it. He rose slowly, the motion deliberate, conserving energy as he turned toward the doorway again, the open sky framing him against something immeasurably large, and for a second he simply stood there, not as a soldier, not as a representative of anything, but as a single person making a decision that would never be recorded in any official report. Then he stepped forward, out of the shelter and into the open, the wind catching against his suit with a low hiss as the ash shifted around his boots, and he lowered his rifle, unclipping it from its harness and setting it gently onto the ground beside him, the sound soft but unmistakable in the stillness. Inside, Lyra's breath caught slightly, the smallest reaction, but she did not call out, did not stop him, because she understood what he was doing even before he completed it. Ethan raised his empty hand slowly, not high, not exaggerated, just enough to show the absence of threat, his posture relaxed but steady, every movement intentional, and he kept his gaze level with the horizon rather than the sky above, as if refusing to posture beneath it, refusing to frame himself as smaller than he already was. The air shifted again, a subtle change in pressure that rolled across the battlefield like a silent wave, and his suit registered a new pattern in the anomaly, a feedback loop between his presence and Lyra's signal, something reinforcing, something building. Behind him, she spoke, her voice carrying farther than it should have, not louder, but clearer, as if the space itself was carrying her words outward. "They see you," she said, and there was something in her tone that felt almost reverent, not toward him, but toward the moment. Ethan did not move, did not turn. He simply stood there, breathing steadily, offering nothing but presence, and for the first time since the sky had opened, one of the massive shapes above shifted more noticeably, not descending, not advancing, but tilting slightly, aligning itself in a way that felt unmistakably like attention focused, like something choosing to look closer. The light around it changed, softening, diffusing further, and the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier. but like a question waiting for an answer that could not be spoken, only shown. And in that quiet, suspended space, the smallest act of standing still became something far larger than either of them had intended, a continuation of a choice that refused to end. The air felt thinner now, not just inside Ethan's lungs but across the entire battlefield, as if the world itself was holding its breath along with him. And he stood there with his hands lowered but open, palms visible, his rifle resting behind him in the dust like something he no longer needed to carry, his shoulders steady even as the strain crept deeper into his muscles, his oxygen hovering near 32%, the number blinking with a quiet persistence that no longer demanded urgency, only acceptance. Above him, the immense shape that had shifted before continued its slow alignment, its surface rippling with faint bands of light that moved in deliberate patterns, not random, not chaotic, but structured, like thought made visible, and Ethan felt that pattern settle over him, not as pressure, but as attention, focused and precise. He did not look away, not because he believed it would change anything, but because looking away felt like breaking something that had taken too much to build. And so he remained still, letting the moment exist without interference. Behind him, inside the fractured structure, Lyra watched with a stillness that mirrored his own, her breathing even now, her posture stronger than before, and though she did not move to join him, her presence extended outward through the signal she carried, reinforcing what he had already shown, amplifying it into something that reached far beyond the two of them. "They are isolating variables," she said softly, her voice carried by the same unseen resonance that had begun to shape the air, separating action from assumption. And Ethan understood enough of that to know what it meant, that they were not just seeing him, they were testing what he represented, measuring whether his choice was an anomaly or a possibility. The ground beneath his boots vibrated faintly, not from impact, not from force, but from something deeper, a shift in the space above that translated downward like a distant echo. And then, slowly, one of the massive forms extended something from its lower edge, not a weapon, not anything sharp or threatening, but a column of light, narrow at first, then widening as it descended, stopping several yards in front of him, hovering just above the surface without touching it. The light did not blind or burn. It simply existed, soft and steady, its edges defined yet fluid, and within it, faint shapes moved, patterns that resembled nothing he recognized but felt intentional, like a language without words. Ethan's suit reacted instantly, alerts cascading across his display as it attempted to classify the phenomenon, to label it, to reduce it to something measurable, but every attempt returned the same result, unknown, and he found himself ignoring the warnings just as he had before, because whatever this was, it was not something his systems could interpret correctly. He took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance by a few feet, not entering the light, not yet, but acknowledging it, meeting it halfway in the only way he knew how. His breathing hitched slightly with the movement, his chest tightening as the reduced oxygen made itself known again, but he steadied himself, drawing in a controlled breath, focusing on the rhythm rather than the discomfort. Behind him, Lyra's voice came again, quieter now, almost reverent. "They are offering observation," she said, direct interaction without hostility, and the weight of that settled into him, because it meant that this was not just a test, it was an invitation. Ethan looked at the light, then briefly over his shoulder at her, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second, enough to confirm what neither of them needed to say. And then he turned back, his focus narrowing once more to the space in front of him. The battlefield around them remained unchanged, broken and silent, but in that narrow column of light, something entirely different existed, something that had never been part of this war. And Ethan knew that stepping forward would not just be another action, it would be a continuation of the same choice he had already made, carried further than he had ever intended. The light pulsed once, gently, not urging, not demanding, simply present, waiting, and Ethan stood there at its edge, feeling the last of his strength balance against the weight of the moment, knowing that whatever happened next would not be decided by force, but by whether he was willing to take one more step. He did not rush it, did not turn the step into something dramatic, because that would have been for himself, not for them. And so Ethan shifted his weight forward with the same steady intention he had used when he first lifted her from the sand. One controlled motion, one measured breath, and he stepped into the light. It did not feel like heat or cold, not pressure or resistance, but something in between, a presence that acknowledged him without touching him. And his suit reacted immediately, systems flaring with data it could not categorize, readings overlapping until they blurred into noise. And then, just as quickly, the alerts quieted, not because the phenomenon ended, but because the systems themselves seemed to stop trying to define it. His oxygen dipped to 30%, the number steady, his breathing shallow but controlled, and yet inside the column of light, the strain did not increase. It simply existed alongside everything else, part of the moment rather than an obstacle to it. The patterns within the light shifted, no longer abstract, no longer distant, forming sequences that almost resembled movement across a surface that was not there, and Ethan felt something change in his perception, not in his eyes, but deeper, as if the light was not showing him something external, but reflecting something internal outward where it could be seen. Behind him, Lyra watched without moving, her expression steady, but her eyes brighter now, the glow beneath her skin responding in perfect sync with the light around him. The signal no longer just hers, no longer just his, but something shared, something amplified. "They are reading intention," she said softly. Her voice carried through the same resonance that filled the air. Not language, not history, only the state. "You choose." And the words settled into him with a clarity that cut through everything else, because intention was the one thing he had not tried to control, the one thing he had simply acted on. Ethan did not raise his hands further, did not change his posture. He simply stood, letting the moment exist without adjustment, his breathing slow, his focus steady, and in that stillness, memories rose unbidden, not as distractions, but as context, the faces he could no longer see, the choices he had made before this one, the reasons he had stopped questioning why he helped when he could. The light pulsed gently around him, responding not to movement but to presence, and the massive form above adjusted once more, its alignment sharpening as if whatever it was perceiving had reached a threshold, a point where uncertainty gave way to something more defined. Ethan's vision dimmed slightly at the edges, the oxygen loss beginning to assert itself more strongly, but he did not step back, did not break the contact, because something in him understood that this was the cost, not a price to be paid, but a natural consequence of standing where he was standing, of choosing to remain when leaving would be easier. "Ethan," Lyra said, and this time she used his name, the sound of it carrying a different weight than anything she had said before, and he turned his head just enough to acknowledge her without leaving the light, their eyes meeting across the short distance, and in hers he saw not uncertainty, not calculation, but something closer to trust, not complete, not blind, but real. "They understand," she said, and there was a quiet certainty in her voice that did not need explanation, and as she spoke, the light around him shifted once more, not expanding, not intensifying, but stabilizing into a form that felt less like a test and more like a conclusion. Above them, the immense shapes began to move again, not forward, not downward, but outward, their positions widening, creating space where before there had been focus, and the sky, still open, no longer felt like a question waiting for an answer, but like an answer that had already been given. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath shallow but steady, his body reaching its limits even as the moment reached its resolution, and for a second, just a second, everything aligned, the weight, the choice, the consequence, all of it balanced in a single point that did not need to be held any longer, only understood. The light did not vanish when he reached his limit, it softened, as if recognizing the edge of what his body could give, and Ethan felt his knees weaken beneath him, the strength draining in slow, steady increments rather than all at once, his oxygen slipping below 28%, each breath thinner, more distant, yet the space around him did not collapse, did not demand more than he could offer. Instead, the column of light shifted downward, not pressing, not forcing, but supporting, its presence adjusting to him in a way that felt almost intentional, almost careful. His vision narrowed slightly, the edges dimming, But at the center, everything remained clear, focused, and in that clarity he saw the sky change again. The massive forms no longer holding their positions in silent judgment, but moving with a purpose that was no longer directed at the ground below, their alignment widening further, their orientation turning outward toward the horizon, toward the stars beyond the atmosphere they had entered. Behind him, Lyra moved for the first time with urgency, not panic, but determination, pushing herself up despite the lingering weakness in her body, each motion controlled, yet driven by something stronger than physical limitation. And she crossed the distance between them in uneven steps before stopping just at the edge of the light, not entering, but close enough that its glow reflected fully across her skin. "They have made their decision," she said, her voice steady, carrying through the quiet air with a certainty that settled over everything like a final note. Ethan managed a faint exhale that might have been a breath of relief if he had more air to spare, his posture lowering slightly as he allowed himself to rest within the support the light now offered, his hands dropping to his sides, no longer needing to signal anything, no longer needing to prove anything. The patterns within the light changed once more, no longer searching, no longer testing, but resolving into a calm, steady rhythm that felt almost like acknowledgement, and the anomaly readings on his display flattened into a smooth line, the chaotic fluctuations replaced by a stability that extended even into his failing systems, slowing the drain just enough to hold him where he was. Lyra's gaze lifted toward the sky, her eyes reflecting the movement above as the immense vessels began to withdraw, not in retreat, not in defeat, but in a deliberate repositioning that carried no trace of hostility, only distance, as if the purpose of their arrival had been fulfilled in a way none of them had anticipated. "They will not continue this conflict," she said quietly, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was more than a temporary choice, more than a pause. It was a shift in understanding. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not out of exhaustion alone, but because the weight he had carried since the moment he found her finally eased, not disappearing, but settling into something that no longer pressed against him with the same force. When he opened them again, the sky was already changing, the massive shapes receding into the upper atmosphere, their forms becoming less defined, less immediate, until they were once again part of something distant, something vast but no longer present in the same way. The column of light around him dimmed gradually, not shutting off, but withdrawing with the same care it had shown in its arrival, and as it receded, Ethan felt the full weight of his body return, the support fading, the strain rising again, but now it was different, now it was simply his own. Lyra stepped closer as the last of the light dissolved into the air, her presence grounding the space where something extraordinary had just existed, and she looked down at him, her expression no longer guarded, no longer uncertain, but clear in a way that required no translation. "You changed the outcome," she said, and the words were simple, but the scale behind them was not. Because this was not about a battlefield, not about a single moment, but about what that moment had become. Ethan shook his head slightly, a small motion, almost instinctive, as he steadied himself against the ground, his breath shallow but real. "No," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "We did." And the distinction mattered, not for credit, but for truth, because nothing in this had been his alone. Above them, the sky closed slowly, the last traces of distortion smoothing back into something that resembled normality, and in the silence that followed, the battlefield felt different, not healed, not restored, but changed in a way that could not be undone, because somewhere far beyond what either of them could see, a decision had been made that would carry far past this moment, far past them, and for the first time since it began, the war no longer felt inevitable. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and Ethan remained where he was, one knee against the cooling ground, his breathing shallow but steady, each inhale still measured but no longer racing against an invisible clock, his oxygen holding just above a critical threshold, as if even his failing systems had chosen to give him a little more time. The sky above had returned to something recognizable, the distortion gone, the immense shapes now nothing more than distant memory etched into the atmosphere, but the space they had occupied still felt different, as if the air itself remembered what had passed through it. Lyra stood beside him now, no longer needing support, her posture upright, her movements balanced, the glow beneath her skin softer but stable, no longer signaling distress, but something quieter, something resolved. And when she looked down at him, there was no distance left in her gaze, no separation between species or sides, only a shared understanding of what had just been carried across that battlefield. Ethan shifted slightly, placing one hand against the ground to steady himself as he pushed up just enough to sit rather than kneel. The motion slow, deliberate, his strength returning in fragments rather than all at once, and he let out a long breath that felt different from the ones before, less strained, less forced, as if his body had finally accepted that it no longer needed to brace for impact. The wind moved again, gentle now, carrying fine grains of sand across the glass surface with a soft hiss that no longer sounded like aftermath, but like something beginning to settle. "They will remember this," Lyra said, her voice quiet but certain, and Ethan glanced up at her, a faint, tired expression crossing his face that might have been a smile if it had more energy behind it. "You think so?" he asked, not doubting, but grounding the statement in something real, something human, and she nodded once, her gaze drifting briefly toward the horizon where the sky met the scarred land. "Not as a battle," she replied, "but as a contradiction that could not be ignored," and the phrasing carried a weight that extended far beyond this place. Ethan let that sit with him, the idea that what had happened here would travel farther than any report, farther than any official record, carried not in data but in perception, in the quiet shift of how one species might begin to see another. He leaned back slightly, resting his shoulders against a fragment of the broken structure, his eyes closing. For a moment, not in exhaustion alone, but in something closer to release, and when he opened them again, the world in front of him felt unchanged in its details but altered in its meaning. Lyra stepped closer, lowering herself just enough to be at his level, not above him, not separate, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove. "Where will you go?" he asked after a while, the question simple, carrying no expectation, and she considered it, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the sky. "Where I am needed," she said, "to carry what this means forward." And then her gaze returned to him, steady, direct. "And you," she added, "what will you do?" And Ethan exhaled softly, looking out across the battlefield that no longer felt like a place of endings, but of something unfinished in a different way. "I will keep doing what I can," he said. And the answer was not grand, not heroic, but it did not need to be. The wind shifted again, lifting small trails of sand into the air before letting them fall. And somewhere in the distance, something metallic creaked as the remains of the battlefield continued to settle into stillness. Lyra rose slowly, her movements fluid now, no trace of the weakness that had once defined her, and she took a step back, not away from him, but toward whatever came next, and for a moment she simply looked at him, committing something unspoken to memory. Ethan watched her go, not with regret, not with expectation, but with a quiet awareness that this moment, this choice, had never belonged to either of them alone. It had simply passed through them, leaving something behind that neither could fully define. The sky above stretched wide and open, empty now, but not the same kind of empty it had been before. And as Ethan drew in another measured breath, steady despite everything, the only thought that settled clearly in his mind was simple, almost quiet in its certainty. He had not been there to change the stars, only to remind them what it meant to carry something without asking why, and somehow that had been enough.